Thank you all very much for being here. It is kind of a full circle tonight. We've done about, as Dave said, 400 talks in about 3 years now in 40 states. So it's good to kind of be back where we began. We are at the point where nobody should be deceived about what Common Core is. There is no debating it anymore. There is no doubting it anymore. We've had plenty of time to see all this in action. I'll show you a lot of what I mean today. We now know what Common Core is. And so this is not going to be one of those talks that I have had to give about 400 times, explaining to people who really don't know what it is, what it is. It is a sad commentary that after 6 years of Common Core, after hundreds of talks and thousands of talks by others as well, 90% of every audience I've spoken to still, as recently as 2 weeks ago in New Jersey, still doesn't know what Common Core is. That's why Common Core is winning. Common Core isn't going anywhere in the short term because too many people still have no idea what it is. And so rather than give you a talk again explaining what it is, I see so many friendly, supportive faces, people who have helped us do this over the years. No point in going back over that old territory. What I'd like to do is break my talk up into two parts. One of those parts is called Farce, because this is a farce, and we'll talk about what that means. And the second part of my talk is failure. How we now know that this whole thing was doomed to fail from the beginning, and as every week goes by, there's more evidence that it is a failure. So starting the talk with farce. What is farce? Farce is absurdity. Farce is something that starts tragic but ends up laughably absurd, and that's where we are with education in this country today. For our quote, we're going to go to somebody who understood how history could be transformed into farce, Karl Marx, right? Karl Marx said, "History repeats itself. First is tragedy. Second is farce." You saw Alex Newman's wonderful talk about the history of education. And so Alex took you back over 100 years to show you how American education went from the best in the world, the freest in the world, the most freedom-promoting in the world, the most equitable in the world, how American education over the last 100 years went from all of that to being a tragedy. A tragedy of failed expectations, a tragedy of lost generations of kids, a tragedy of too much corporate involvement, too much meaningless testing, too little real accountability. We're at the point now where this is farce. What Marx meant by that is, if you win the battle of history, if you tragically transform freedom into tyranny, success into low expectations, if you do that, that's the tragedy. Everything that comes next is farce, and Common Core is nothing but pure farce. Start with, we all remember this guy. Let's talk about farce. This is John Gruber, you may remember. He's one of the architects of Obamacare. He's the man that the taxpayers, you and I, paid over $4 million over the last 5 years to consult on the implementation of Common Core. And here's what he has to say about how it got passed.
If you had a law which said healthy people are going to pay in, it made explicit that healthy people pay in and sick people get money, it would not have passed. Okay? Just like lack of transparency is a huge political advantage. And basically, call it the stupidity of the American voter or whatever. But basically, that was really, really critical to getting the thing to pass.
So, you see what we mean by farce, right? Transparency is hugely, we couldn't have passed, if we'd have told you what it was, Nancy Pelosi, right? If we had you read it before we passed it, you never would have passed it. Call it the ignorance of the American voter, if you will. They've got us busy with 1,000 different crises every week, right? Trying to pay mortgage, gas prices, keeping up with everything. Lack of transparency is a huge advantage to those who would turn tragedy into farce. Common Core, say what you will about Obamacare, disastrous as it was, it was voted on in the House and the Senate. It was appeared before the Supreme Court, right, where it had a hearing. None of that was done with Common Core. Nobody was consulted about Common Core. I've said many times in my talks that this education reform is every bit, probably more dangerously transformational than even healthcare, because you're getting kids as young as 5 and 7 and 9 and 12, and you are completely warping them with regards to how to view their own government, how to view their civic responsibilities. You're shielding from them critical information about what's made this country successful and fundamentally decent. You're shielding that information. And you're replacing it with a lot of loaded propaganda and of that type. So keep Mr. Gruber in mind as we walk our way through some aspects of Common Core. The NEA farce. Well, I want to add one thing to what Alex taught you about the history of this country. Take the NEA, the National Education Association, arguably the most visible guide of American public education for the last 70, 80 years. starting in 1948. Quotes from 1948 through 1970. Right when American education was completely stopped being a tragedy and became a farce. And what I think is really remarkable about the years 1947 and 1948, as this country was winning the bloodiest war in human history, beating back ultimately both communism and fascism, as we did that, as the greatest generation gave the ultimate sacrifice to ensure liberty and freedom, our educational mentors, our educational guardians were already plotting the overthrow of that through public education. 1947, the NEA. Far too many people in America, both in and out of education, look upon the elementary school as a place to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic. Well, how dare you? Right? The idea, and that's where a lot of us are today, right? A lot of Americans are waking up and say, well, what happened to reading, writing, and arithmetic? They had no intention of leaving it that way. You heard about Horace Mann and you heard about John Dewey, right? Education for international understanding involves the use of education as a force for conditioning the will of the people. Right? This is globalism. This is UN. This is UNESCO that Alex talks so eloquently about. Right? The purpose of modern American education in post-World War II, in the post-World War II world, was to transition American kids, not to teach them how to read, to write, critical thinking, but to transition them to global existence, global citizenship. And by the time you get to 1969, right, schools will become clinics whose purpose is to provide individualized psychosocial treatment for the student. And teachers must become psychosocial therapists. You can see in that 22-year period how much of what is modern Common Core, this emphasis on sociology, this emphasis on social transformation, this emphasis not on mastery, but on politics and ideology. In that short window, history became farce, right? At the moment of America's greatest triumph, not just for our country, but for all of humanity. At that moment, the whole thing was being subjugated, right? Subverted. Let me give you a couple examples. Talk a lot about Common Core. I'll show you as we move forward that one of the big great lies of Common Core that they're still peddling is that it was somehow state-led. It was somehow led by governors. It was somehow democratically operated. You've heard, was it P.T. Barnum who said, if you're going to lie, lie big. The big lies are always the ones that are the most easily believed. But let's just start with the feds. Let's start with what I call federalizing farce. Let's start with Arne Duncan, because if you listen to the people in charge of federal education in this country, not just the unions, the NEA, but certainly the Department of Education Secretary, the Chief Educational Officer in the land, a man, by the way, who really has no practical teaching experience. He's never been a classroom teacher. He doesn't know what teachers go through. He's a sociologist by trade, which is interesting. How did we get a sociologist in the Chief Educational Office in the country and not, an educator? Because, as it's now clear, Common Core was never meant to be about education. Common Core is not about, it never was intended to make your kids better, brighter, stronger, more competitive. It was always, always intended to sociologize them, to change the way they think, not in terms of skills, but in terms of politics and ideas. And here's what Mr. Duncan said back in 2009 when the whole scheme was getting rolling about the role of American schools in this new world.
I think our schools should be open 12, 13, 14 hours a day. So it's not just lengthening.
So 8 to 8 or something like that?
At home, we attached healthcare clinics to about 24 of our schools. Where schools truly become the centers of the community, great things happen. And this is a chance to really create what I think the 21st century school has to look like. This needs to be the norm, not the exception. Time matters tremendously, and all of our families need our doors open longer.
Is this a big ticket item in terms of financial resources?
Finances is a piece of this, and we again have significant financial resources, unprecedented financial resources coming to the table. But let me be clear, this is thinking differently and being creative.
Thinking differently, being creative. But the irony is there's nothing different about this. They've been thinking this way through the 60s and then through the 40s, pre-World War II, through Dewey and back through John Rockefeller and all the way back to Horace Mann. They've always been thinking this way. There's nothing new or different about this. They're not implementing a new plan. They've reached the zenith of their ability to transform these schools. And did you hear the faux pas he said? He called the schools stores at one point. He had a verbal slip. Our stores need to be open 24/7. Your daughter, your 12-year-old daughter brings 2 Midol to school. She can be suspended and expelled from class. But they're now opening clinics, building new schools with clinics attached, right? Because we want our schools open 8, 12, 14 hours a day. We want them open 7 days a week. We want our kids to be there all the time. We want them to become the centers of the community. We want the schools to do your parenting. You now have breakfast, lunch, and dinner served in at school at all the major cities in this country by the public schools. You have communities winning grants from the federal government to continue to feed American children all summer long. Because if you feed them for 9 months, the idea they have, the federal government, of your families, that you can't feed your kids, you won't feed your kids. If the schools feed them for 9 months, 3 meals a day, then your kids are obviously going to starve to death before classes start in September. So school districts like Memphis, Tennessee have won big federal grants to open their schools in the summer all day to feed breakfast, lunch, and dinner to kids. And of course, as we've been told, it's discriminatory to only give free breakfast, lunch, and dinner to those kids who are financially needy. So we've got to give it to all kids now. All right? We've got to make all kids. And this is not about generosity. If they're feeding all your kids, including the wealthy kids, because that's socially just, then they're replacing you. And that's part of what this is. Arnie Duncan, very recently, we go from 2009 to just this month.
The one idea I threw out that I wanted to sort of road test it with the kids and see what they thought is the idea of public boarding schools. And that's a little bit of a different idea or a controversial idea. But the question is, do we have some children where there's not a mom, there's not a dad, there's not a grandma, there's just nobody home? And there are certain kids we should have 24/7.
Boarding schools. And think about the logic of that. Do you know of any of those places? Do we actually have homes in this country where nobody's present but kids in them? Do we actually have that? No moms, no dads, no grandmas, no grandpas, no cousins, no dogs, just kids living in the average 2-bedroom ranch. Is that what's happening? And don't we have a federal mechanism, a state and local mechanism for dealing with abandoned kids living in homes? Don't we have that? No, they've got to go to boarding schools. And how soon do we implement this, right? When the federal government starts deciding which kids belong with the state and not with you. They're already feeding them. They're already going to put these clinics on all the new school buildings. So your kids can't bring anything to school, but you're darn well sure the schools can provide all sorts of things to your kids medically, even underage, right? The plans of all of this. And of course, federalizing farce, blaming the victim. Whenever people stand up and protest these things, well, always play the race card, right?
In defending a controversial program to raise math and English standards nationwide, the education secretary instead added fuel to the fire. He said some of the pushback is coming from sort of white suburban moms who all of a sudden their child isn't as brilliant as they thought they were.
If you're a white suburban mom, you're a soccer mom, right? You know, the ones that voted for Clinton all those years ago. If you're a typical suburban white mom with her kids and her soccer and her cars, and you object to all this in loco parentis, all this big government intervention in your family, well, it's just because you can't stand the fact that your kids aren't as smart as you thought you are. You see what Common Core does? What's the common in Common Core? It commonizes education, right? It pulls it down. If you're going to get more and more kids to the same place, 60 million American school kids, you're going to get more and more of those kids to exactly the same place in education. By definition, that has to be a lower place, doesn't it? And that's what this is. And the common denominator of all this, what makes it common, is every kid's going to know the same thing. And what that means, if we're going to stop at every kid being able to know and understand the same way, that means that those kids who can know better and understand more and learn more and memorize more and succeed more, they have to be cut off. And to do that, you have to remove the parental instinct. You got to stop thinking of your kids as quantities, as agents who you can make good, better, best. You got to start thinking of them as part of the collective. Remember Melissa Harris Perry at MSNBC? Got to stop you parents from thinking that the kids belong to you, they belong to the community, right? That's what this is. And how about this idea? And I make this point all the time. You've heard for 6 years now how Common Core is rigorous, right? In fact, that was the key argument for why we should take it. It's so much better, it's so much more rigorous than anything we've ever had before. Please explain to me how they could have known that when it's only been tested the last 2 months. For the first time in 6 years, 44 states were tested between April and May, actually between March and May. The first Common Core, and that includes Wisconsin, first Common Core tests were only offered this past semester. How can you call Common Core rigorous? How can you say it's better than what we have when you've only now tested it for the first time a few months ago? There's no way you can know that. And yet they throw the word rigor at you. And when you dare, like these poor moms and dads, right? When you dare to say, how do you know that? You just don't like the fact, you bigot, that your kids aren't as smart as you thought they were, right? Let's give the lie to rigor. Let's use their words. You're hearing Arnie Duncan tell it to you. You don't even, I'm just the humble moderator here. We're going to let all these people tell you what they think. Here's what Bill Gates says about the rigor of Common Core.
It would be great if our education stuff worked, but that we won't know for probably a decade.
$6 billion of his personal wealth gone to promote, implement, bribe, and propagandize for Common Core. The single biggest private donor to Common Core. He looked you in the eyes 2 years ago in 2013 and he said, we're at Harvard University, and said, we're not going to know until 2023 if it even works. How is that rigorous? This isn't me saying it. This is the guy who bankrolled it. This is the biggest promoter of it on the international stage, telling you we're not going to know for 10 years if it works. How can you call that rigorous? And how about the farce of teacher control? They're still peddling that over in Madison, that we have local control of our schools. Our teachers are free to teach however they want to teach, no pressure whatsoever. The standards are just this neutral guide to get kids there any way the teachers want them to. Well, again, listen to Mr. Gates back in 2009, when this whole thing was getting rolling.
We'll only know if this effort has succeeded when the curriculum and tests are aligned to these standards. Secretary Arnie Duncan recently announced that $350 million of the stimulus package will be used to create just these kinds of tests, next generation assessments aligned to the Common Core. When the tests are aligned to the common standards, the curriculum will line up as well.
So, which just happened, right? March, April, May of 2015, the tests have now finally been aligned to the Common Core. What he told you is right. When we finally align the test to the standards, the curriculum will line up as well. The only way we have to measure Common Core are the big, meaningless, one-size-fits-all national standardized tests. That's the only way that anybody's paying attention to. What your teachers report, they see with their own eyes, no one's paying any attention to that. All they care about are these tests. If your teachers are going to get hired in the first place moving forward, if they're going to retain their jobs, if they're going to be promoted, they're going to have to prove that their kids can do a certain score on those tests. That means that whatever the tests demand, the teachers have to teach. Where's the local control? That man, you probably know if you're in the audience today, but a lot of people don't. The liberal Huffington Post calls David Coleman the most powerful educational administrator nobody's ever heard of. That right there is the architect of Common Core. He's been the recipient of all kinds of Bill Gates money. He's the man who organized it. He's the man who ran it. He's the his own Wikipedia site tells you he is the chief architect of the Common Core standards. This man has never been a teacher, never taken a single education course. He has no educational background whatsoever. He is, by his own admission, utterly unqualified to have done this. He's the guy the federal government put in charge of this. And we'll prove that to you in a moment. Listen to what I call this the farce, that these are somehow educator-driven standards. That somehow this whole business was done by busy bee teachers working long hours across the states in conjunction with governors and state legislatures to hammer all this out. Listen to this. Here's David Coleman being introduced in 2011 at a leadership meeting at the University of Pittsburgh.
He has been involved in virtually every step of setting the national standards, and he doesn't have a single credential for it. He's never taught in an elementary school, I think. I actually don't know. He's never edited a scholarly journal, but I think he has written scholarly papers, and a variety of other things that everybody here has done some of. He hasn't done.
You'd think someone with Lauren's experience would understand you never tell the truth when you're introducing someone.
I don't know what's more pathetic. The fact that this is the guy that transformed your schools. You never heard of him. This is the guy that was responsible for this. He, by his own admission, has no qualifications. I don't know what's more pathetic. That that's who's doing this to you? Or the fact that an entire room full of teachers who take orders from him are laughing at this. All right? What does that tell you about that public school mentality when it comes to servitude, right? Somebody gets up there, tells you he has no experience, demonstrates he doesn't know what he's doing, and you fall lockstep behind it. Gets even better, all right? Here's David Coleman talking about the farce that is educator-driven standard.
I actually think it's really important to try to base what I'm about to say to you on evidence I share with you rather than on the sands of my qualifications. So if I ask you or talk to you about doing something, it should be evident that it makes sense to you to do because I have no other authority.
Because you have no other authority, right? This is who's running the show here. Oh, and by the way, you know where he is now, right? Right? This is the guy that no sooner did he oversee the writing of the Common Core standards than he left Common Core, and now he is the president of the college boards. He's in charge of your kids' SATs. He's rewriting the exams your kids have to take to get into college to conform to his Common Core standards. How does this happen in a constitutional republic? Well, how many of our kids know we're a constitutional republic anymore, right? But how does this happen? Unelected, unappointed, unaccountable to you and me. There's no way you and I can get at him. He's the guy that's behind it all. Ultimately, he's being paid to do so by people like Bates, and he's being put there, ultimately, by the current administration. And I'll show that to you, in presidential administration, the federal government. I'll show you that, too, in a minute. But it gets better still, right?